This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my intuitive eating online course and community. If you're ready to leave diet culture behind and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor, offering online courses and programs to help people all over the world make peace with food. Join me here every week as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food and their bodies.
I remember I was teething, little gums bleeding, cried every evening, it was all about eating. When I became a teen, it was all about beef, and now I'm ready for the world. Try and sink my teeth in, stacking it.
Hey there, welcome to episode 153 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with Sophia Carter-Kahn, a writer and body positive podcaster who co-hosts the podcast She's All Fat. We talked about her path from extreme dieting to intuitive eating, how dating interacts with fat phobia and weight bias, overcoming body shame and body dysmorphia, and so much more. It's a really great conversation, and I can't wait to share it with you in just a moment. But first, I have some really exciting news that I've been dying to tell you and that I alluded to or kind of said in last week's episode, which is that I got a book deal. I'm so excited. This is something that I've been working toward for my whole 15 plus year journalism career. And really, I've wanted to write books since before I could even literally write. I was dictating books to my mom at 3 years old. And when people asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I always said an author when I was a kid. So this is a total dream come true. This is a huge deal. And really, a lot of the reason that it happened now was because of you and the podcast. So I'm so grateful to you for listening and supporting the show, and so grateful for this platform that's really allowed me to work out ideas about people's relationships with food and their bodies and really find my voice in the 5 years that I've been making it, which, by the way, my 5-year anniversary of starting the podcast actually just came and went several weeks back on March 13th. And I totally forgot to even mention it this year because I've been so wrapped up in my book and writing and all that good stuff. So I'm really excited. And probably you're asking yourself right now, what is this book about and what is it called? Well, it's a really deep dive into all the things we're always talking about here, specifically diet culture and how it functions as a life thief to rob us of our precious time on this planet. And the title is Enough: How to Say No to the Life Thief That Is Diet Culture. Although, of course, the title could change in the editing process, but I really love it for now. And it's being published by Little Brown Spark imprint in late 2019. So I'm really psyched because they're just a great team. They totally get it. And Little Brown has also published some amazing and groundbreaking writers that I really admire, like Malcolm Gladwell and J.D. Salinger. So I feel really honored to be in that company working with them as a publisher. So I'll be sharing more details about the book, of course, as it gets closer to the publication date. And, late 2019 feels like a long time from now, but I'm sure it's going to come up real fast. So you'll hear me talking about the book pretty soon. But meanwhile, I'm happily writing away. And if you want to stay up to date on the book and all my other goings on, you can join my email list at christyharrison.com/email, and I'll be sure to keep you in the loop. Okay, so now I'll answer this week's listener question. It's from a listener named Michelle who writes, in one of your recent podcast episodes, I heard you say that meal plans are needed in early recovery from restrictive eating disorders, utilizing Evelyn Tribole's cast for a broken leg analogy. Personally, and I know that I am not alone, I hear over and over again from those like me who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars at the top eating disorder treatment centers only to be given a restrictive diet, an exchange-based meal plan, and a restrictive too low weight range and calling that quote-unquote recovery. The meal plan ended up being more like an elastic bandage for a broken leg. Full healing was impossible because the treatment was insufficient for the injury. I would really like to hear in a future podcast why this is the case when there's evidence that for many of us, following a meal plan is like replacing one eating disorder with another, replacing one obsession with another. For me and others like me, we have found full freedom only through full meal support, where the food is plated and residents have zero choice in portion sizes, types of food, leaving food on the plate, using rituals, etc. There are no menu choices, which is just another thing to obsess over. No food exceptions or preferences, including vegetarianism. Food allergies must be medically documented and supported. No speaking about food, weight, body, calories, or fat. No reading or watching diet-related articles. No negotiation. monitored exercise restriction, and surrender of weight. For me, as an adult in her third decade of anorexia, after countless hospitalizations, inpatient, outpatient, et cetera, I did this modified family-based treatment approach with my husband as my meal support provider. I'm really curious to hear if in your experience, you see that meal plans really work toward providing full freedom from your clients with restrictive eating disorders. So thanks, Michelle, for that question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for medical or mental health advice. So I love your analogy of the elastic bandage for a broken leg, because those restrictive too low meal plans that make you count exchanges, which some treatment centers use, which I don't understand why really, are exactly that, a Band-Aid solution that ultimately doesn't facilitate full healing. So that is true. It also doesn't mean that we throw out the idea of a proper cast for a broken limb though, right? So just because someone who's uninformed might put an elastic bandage on a broken limb doesn't mean we should abandon the whole enterprise of helping people heal. And first of all, I want to say that everyone's recovery journey is different. Everyone's eating disorder or disordered eating experience is different. And some people can afford residential treatment while others can't, which, as you alluded to, is extremely expensive. And some people can't even get the proper diagnosis that would allow them to get residential treatment because of weight stigma on the part of many medical and mental health providers who might still hold an outdated belief that the only way to have an eating disorder is if you look emaciated or are at a really low weight, not recognizing that people of all sizes and people in larger bodies can have eating disorders and restrictive eating disorders too. So the type of quote unquote cast that people are going to get on their broken limb is going to look very different. It's like how some people get neon colored casts, like kids. Some people get plain white ones. Some people get those walking casts or have a sling on top of their cast. Some people get their friends to sign their cast, whatever, right? There's lots of different ways a cast can look, but its function is generally the same. So in the case of treatment for eating disorders before getting back to intuitive eating, people definitely need something that ensures they're going to eat enough to meet their body's needs for recovery and help them break out of restrictive patterns of thinking about portion size. So when I talk about meal plans, that's really what I'm talking about, is something that helps you eat enough. And enough is a really important concept to me. That's the title of my book. And really, I think it's so important in recovery from eating disorders, because eating enough, knowing that you are enough, having enough with diet culture, being fed up with it, all of those things are ways that we heal. And so, when it comes to the eating part, eating enough is a way that you heal. So for you, Michelle, who asked the question, that was having someone else set your menu and serve you food, right? And at most residential treatment centers that I've heard of, or at least the good ones anyway, that is what everyone starts off with. Everyone starts off having their meals set out for them, having no choice in their menu. But, there needs to be someone really knowledgeable and recovery-minded determining how much and what kinds of food is going to be served on that menu. Because, if you think about it, it wouldn't do you any good to have your friend who's in the throes of a restrictive eating disorder decide your menu, right? That would probably look like a pretty disordered menu. So if the goal is having you eat enough so that your body and brain can heal from your eating disorder, and that, by the way, goes for anyone with an eating disorder, whether it's restrictive eating disorder, pure binge eating disorder, a binge restrict combo, or, any sort of compensatory behaviors as well. All types of eating disorders require that you eat enough so that your body and your brain can heal from the eating disorder. And so, if you want to have a menu that's like that, it's essential to have someone in charge of serving your food who has a good relationship with food themselves, right? Who's not disordered, and who can create a ballpark estimate of what's going to be enough to accomplish that healing for you, and monitor you to make sure that you're making progress in your recovery. Because when your food is not enough, your brain is going to stay sick as well as your body. So really what that is a meal plan, right? Even if you call it something different, there's someone making a meal plan for you, even if it's not you executing it yourself. So that's part of what I'm talking about when I talk about a meal plan as a stepping stone into intuitive eating is, yes, at this early stage, especially for people who are in the throes of severe restriction, making your own choices about food probably isn't going to be possible. Listening to your intuition about food probably isn't going to be possible when you're so, your mind is so taken over and your body is so taken over by the eating disorder. So what you really need is someone you can trust to, set up your food for you and make sure you're eating enough and make sure that you're not having any medical complications and all that stuff. So that's the first stage, I would say, of recovery. Like that's the first type of cast for eating disorder recovery. But then there's, the situations where people aren't in that first stage of recovery, or, they can't go to a residential treatment center because that's not something that's available to everyone. And so they have to do it outside. And so this next stage of recovery, which is what I'll call the second stage, is about, starting to make your own food choices within a safe context that still ensures that you eat enough, and learning to challenge the eating disorder voice that comes up when you do that. So for some people, that's what their whole recovery is going to have to look like, because they just can't afford to go to treatment, or because, like I said, treatment can be really weight biased, and even getting a diagnosis is very weight biased. So if you don't have a diagnosis, then you don't qualify for residential treatment per, the treatment facilities admission criteria, or your insurance's admission criteria, if you can even get insurance to pay for residential treatment, which most insurances don't, or they only pay a small portion. So, for some people, they're going to have to cobble their recovery together on the outside, in the outside world, right? And some people don't have anyone in their lives who has a good relationship with food and can be a meal support person for them. Like, it's very fortunate that you have your husband, and it sounds like that's been a really effective meal support relationship. Unfortunately, not everyone has someone in their life that can execute a meal support plan in a helpful way. Think about, like, if you had, your mom with an eating disorder or something, or your friend with an eating disorder trying to support you, it would probably be kind of a shit show, right? Also, I will say that family-based treatment approach can feel too restrictive for a lot of people. Like, some people, that actually feels like a disordered thing too, having someone else determine their food for them. So, it's like I said, recovery is very individual. Everybody's recovery is different, but some people do have to sort of cobble things together on the outside. And so for people in this position, the cast that they wear to, be able to heal their broken bone and get to the place of intuitive eating is going to be a little different. It might be like, one of those walking casts I mentioned, right? So that's like, say you're doing it all outpatient, you have an eating disorder dietitian that's helping you come up with a plan for how you're going to meet your food needs. Again, focusing entirely on getting enough, right? It's all about enough in the context of your life. So that means helping you plan meals and snacks that are going to sustain and satisfy you, and considering things like your budget and the amount of time you have to prepare food, and your taste preferences that have nothing to do with the eating disorder, right? Like, you just really don't like a food that the dietitian recommends and has nothing to do with the eating disorder. Not everyone is ready for this phase of recovery yet, obviously, because it does require a ton of decision making, and you're going to have to challenge the eating disorder thoughts that arise when you make a choice that goes against your eating disorder. But ultimately, going through this phase at some point is necessary for you to be able to get to full recovery and intuitive eating. So however long it takes to be in that first phase that you talked about, where hopefully you can have a support system, someone either doing family-based, like a modified family-based treatment, or being in a residential treatment center or partial hospitalization program, but not everyone has access to that. So, the second stage, which is kind of ideally for people who've already gone through that first stage, some people have to start out in the second stage, right? And so for some people, depending on their eating disorder history, the second phase of recovery is going to be a lot more messy and self-directed, because they either can't afford a dietitian, or they've had bad experiences with them and don't trust them, or a million other reasons, And so again, not a perfect world, right? It's not, recovery doesn't happen in the way that treatment providers would recommend all the time. And I've seen this type of self-directed recovery happen for people who've been in the restrict binge cycle, where it can be effective when they decide to just let go of the restriction part and let themselves eat as much as they want for as long as they need, even if it results in binging, without doing anything to compensate for the binging. And that can feel really scary. Some of you might be quaking in your boots listening to that, right? And it's definitely not a good idea for anyone who's just a restrictive eater without any binging tendencies, or anyone who's tempted to use compensatory behaviors after binging, because then it just makes the eating disorder a whole lot worse if you're giving into that. But for some folks who can totally reject the restriction and not do anything to compensate, that ends up being their path to recovery. Like, that ends up being their cast on the broken limb before they can get to the full expression of intuitive eating. Rachel Cole talked about that on her podcast episode 81. She did a ton of reading, though, about eating disorders, and was also working with a therapist who specialized, or who knew about eating disorders, I think. So she had support, and she had someone who would have put their foot down and referred her to a higher level of care if her self-directed plan wasn't working, which is so important, because it definitely could have gone really wrong. So again, that's definitely not what I would recommend for most people, especially for anyone who just restricts and doesn't binge, or who binges and then uses compensatory behaviors. But it's just an example of how, for people with the restrict binge cycle, the real world recovery can be messy and individual, and that some people are able to find their way by just trusting their body's instinct to binge as a means of healing from the starvation, even if it's not what treatment providers would recommend in general. And I'll also say a good eating disorder dietitian who is health at every size informed and isn't weight biased is going to let your body do whatever it wants to do and get to whatever weight it needs to be for full recovery, which is something that only your body gets to decide. So as health at every size informed eating disorder dietitians, we don't set restrictive too low weight ranges or give too low meal plans to anyone, because we know that whatever size your body ends up at when you're in solid recovery, that's the size it wants to be. And so it sounds like, Michelle, you and your friends who've gone through such hard times with treatment programs, which is very common, unfortunately, you are working with providers who are very weight biased. And that's unfortunately just so common in the eating disorder treatment world. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping to change with this podcast, because I know a lot of eating disorder treatment providers listen to the show, including many who work at treatment centers. And I just want to give a shout out to those providers who truly get health at every size and who are making a difference in their clients' lives and reducing weight bias, because I know sometimes it's like swimming upstream if you're working for an organization with weight biased policies and procedures, to try to be health at every size in an environment like that. It's really hard. It's a fight. And so I just want to encourage you to keep fighting. And eventually, I hope that many of you fight your way to the top so that you can change those policies at those treatment centers and help people like Michelle and everyone else receive health at every size, weight inclusive care. So I hope that helps answer your question. And if you're listening and you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. Then if you want a whole library of answers from me to help you master intuitive eating, plus the chance to ask me any question you want and have me answer it quickly, come join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. I do an exclusive monthly Q&A podcast with answers to hundreds of members' questions already. And when you join the course, you can ask me your questions and have me answer them in the following month's Q&A. We also have a private Facebook group just for course members, and a member named Sarah just posted the nicest comment that she said I could share with you all here. She wrote, "I just wanted to say that I'm really grateful for all that I've learned in intuitive eating fundamentals. It has always been tough for me to let go of the thin ideal, and through this group and the podcast, I am learning that there's so much more to life than chasing after vain attempts to shrink my body. Dieting really is the life thief. Now I have my life back, and I am able to give of myself to the people around me. I have more acceptance of my body and everybody. It's such an eye-opening experience how dieting has made me judge other people too, because I was so brainwashed by diet culture standards. It's not easy to let go of the thin ideal, and sometimes that judgmental voice wants to creep back in, but I know it's a non-linear process. I love this journey, and if I can say one bold statement, I am happier today than I ever was when I was at my thinnest size." So I'm so grateful to Sarah for sharing that, and I'm so grateful to all my course members who really support each other on this journey to reclaiming their lives from diet culture. If you're ready to join them in breaking free from the life thief so that you can start devoting your time and energy to the things that really matter in life, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Sophia Carter-Kahn. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
So we refound recently when I was going through a bunch of medical records to try to take to my current nutritionist. I found like a medical thing from when I was 5 when I went to the doctor for a checkup, and the doctor had written on it, "Too fat, less dessert."
Oh my God.
When I was 5. So I think like that kind of says it all. Just like neither of my parents had like a lot of eating issues at all. And I was always like chubby, but like honestly looking at photos, it's like chubby like a kid is chubby. Just like I look like a lot of the women on my dad's side of the family. And I kind of don't ever remember not being told that I needed to lose weight, not by my parents, but by like my peers, or I do remember like those doctor visits being told that like my body wasn't okay. And it's also interesting because like looking back at those records that I had some blood tests, I went in specifically then because I had gotten the thing that if you have chicken pox, you can get it later in life.
Shingles.
Yeah, I'd gotten shingles, which like usually only old people get, but was like showing up on me from stress and should have been assigned to my doctor then and is assigned to my doctors now that I have a lot of like autoinflammatory problems and issues with that. But instead of like looking further into any of those, it was immediately like, oh, more importantly, she's chubby and we need to work on that, which has kind of been like the story of my whole life with doctors until very recently. So my mom and my sister both have very similar body types, which is like it's very different from mine. They're both like tall and kind of naturally slender. And I'm like shorter and chubbier. And like my mom always would be like, she called me her little milkmaid. Like I just look, chubby and I got red cheeks and just like the way that I am. But when I was younger, I gained a bunch of weight when I was like in pre-puberty times through like starting to have disordered eating from like stress and some emotional things. And nobody in my family really knew what it was. Like neither my parents had experience with it. And the doctors that we went to just were like, just put her on a diet. And that's what they did, which was not helpful. Didn't teach me good things.
Right. Probably exacerbated the problem too. If the issue was eating for emotional reasons, if you add deprivation to that, it just kind of adds fuel, gasoline to the fire.
Exactly. It just taught me how to binge eat like very early, secretly, like at night. And so I didn't realize until I was older that like a lot of the things that I had thought or said or been told or did from a very young age were very disordered eating wise. It's like interesting. I've had a lot of conversations with my mom about it where she like, when I first started getting into body positivity and sharing stuff with her, she was like 100% on board with everything. And then at one point she like came to me and was like really emotional and like, she like apologized to me and was really upset and felt like she had done all these bad things to me. And I was like, oh no, like I don't feel that way at all. I feel like she also was like tricked by kind of what she was told and what she saw in the culture around her and was trying to do what she thought was like best for her child. And as I got older, like when I was less of a child and more of a teenager and more in control of my eating and like meaning like I wasn't being fed food, I could order food and it became more like my choice what was going on with my food and more intentional disordered eating really. I have a lot of memories of my mom being like, I don't think she understood what was going on, but she was like, you need to be kind to yourself. Like, I love you and like your body's fine. But I didn't really like hear it or understand it. And neither of us really understood everything that was going on. So I don't know. It's interesting because I don't think anyone else in my family has ever really had disordered eating, but like definitely what happened with me as a child was that. I don't know how that happened exactly.
I mean, yeah, what do you think brought that about? Because it sounds like you were on diets or being restricted from eating from a very young age. So having that already, I think, sets people up for a potential for disordered eating.
Totally. I mean, I think also it was hard because my mom was doing what the doctor told her to do, So she thought she was being helpful. And then later, as I got older, I like asked to be on programs like Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig or whatever. And she was like, okay, if you want to, like it was kind of a thing where if she had been more educated or she'd had the resources, it probably would have gone a totally different way. But again, it's like not her fault at all. She was just trying to do what she thought would be best for my health.
Right. And she was listening to the diet culture entrenched society around her that was telling her that was the way to go for your health, which makes complete sense. And so many parents fall into that trap and then blame themselves, which is so sad because...
Yeah. And also, I think one thing that I've been able to contextualize better as an adult is that as a teenager, my body responded very differently to ways of eating than my sisters did. And I think my mom probably was coming into it with that mindset too, where like both my mom and my sister, their weight stays within a certain range. They've never like really had huge swings. They notice a much more distinct, like if they don't feel well and so eat less for a couple days, their weight will go down a little bit and then it'll normalize. Like for them, it feels much more like a one-to-one thing that happens and makes sense. And my body has never felt that way. When I was a kid or like on these diets, I always got very, like one thing that really exacerbated it and contributed to having disordered eating was feeling like it didn't matter what I did, my body wasn't responding or listening to what I was doing in the way that I saw it happening differently for my sister and my mom. And then when now that I'm older, and I'm like, oh, I have like, number one, I have a different body. And number two, I have PCOS. I have other autoimmune things. Like I have stomach issues. Like I have inflammatory issues. Like I have all these things that are like, of course, your body isn't responding in the same way. Like you have a totally different set of things going on. But at the time, I was just like, I'm not doing it well enough because I saw diets, quote unquote, working, meaning like my mom could lose if she wanted to, but she only ever wanted to lose like. Does that make sense kind of?
Totally. Yeah. So, it sounds like she was sort of entrenched in diet culture as well, but the way that her body responded was more in line with how bodies are, quote unquote, supposed to respond to diets. And your body was very resistant and sort of, was probably trying to look out for you and not let you go through a famine.
Exactly. It's sad looking back on it because like I remember being 10 and like arguing with her because I wanted to go to Weight Watchers so badly. And she was like, I don't think this is a good idea. Like, I think you're fine. Like, we don't need to do this. And I was like, the doctor said I have to lose weight. And she was like, okay. Like, I just think with such compassion for her about it now, because she just so clearly was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Like, I don't know what the right thing to do is. I think this is the right thing,
Totally. And parents are all just doing the best they can. Like I'm now almost the age my parents were when they had me. And I think like, I have no idea what the fuck I'm doing. Like, I'm figuring things out. I know how to run a business now. I know how to like, that piece of my life sort of makes sense, but it's been so much trial and error. And like with kids, it would just be another huge trial and error thing. Like there's no manual. Nobody tells you how to do it. You're just like doing the best you can. And they throw so many curveballs at you too. Like a 10-year-old who's asking to go to Weight Watchers. It's like, oh crap. I'd never considered what I would do in that situation.
Right. I mean, it's cool because now like a bunch of my boyfriend's cousins have kids and last time I saw them were telling me about how like none of them have, to my knowledge, had a lot of eating issues or like, grew up with disordered eating, but they're all part of these Facebook groups that are like, we're trying to teach our kids not diet culture and like talking about this stuff. Like it's much more. They have many more resources, I think, than my mom did.
That's really nice. It's great to hear that people are finding those resources and not necessarily even people who are steeped in the anti-diet world, just kind of usual parents. I'm curious with your experience with Weight Watchers, if you ever did end up going, and also what your experience was like in the context of thinking about Weight Watchers now offering, free programs to teenagers and what you think about that from your own experience.
Oh my God. Yeah, we talked about this on the podcast last week. For me, Weight Watchers was definitely a part of kind of codifying and giving me tools to have disordered eating in a way that was much more intentional and like thought through. Whereas before it was like, when I was little, it was just I learned a lot of emotional eating. And then as soon as I started programs like Weight Watchers and mostly stuck with Weight Watchers, it was much more like gave me things to think about and math to do, which is why like, yeah, I'm super against them. If I hadn't had to fight with my mom about it, and I would have done it in secret and that would have made it much worse, I think. And also just like, Weight Watchers does not, I'm sure you've talked about this a million times on your show too, but Weight Watchers does not teach you about what good food is. Like, I know that the program has changed several times. It changed when I was doing it, but I know the points value and the calories, and I know the points value for several different iterations of the points program for every single food. And yet it wasn't until like really the last year when I worked with a nutritionist to really figure out what foods were healthy and good for my body specifically, that I ever stopped to consider things like, how does eating this kind of food make my body feel? Like I'd never thought about that before, ever. And doing Weight Watchers was so, and it's like messed up to do it when you're a growing teen. It's like your body's changing. I talked with my co-host about this actually, that like when I was that age, I was like a larger weight than my doctor wanted me to be. And I was like definitely chubby. And I had this fantasy of like, if I could just stay the weight I am, I'll grow several more inches and then I'll be quote unquote normal. And I was like, okay, all I got to do is like stay the same weight or lose weight. And Weight Watchers is like, you do the weekly weigh-ins and you do this and you do that. And every single time I would cycle through being on it, it would be the same thing. I would like lose weight at the beginning. And then there would be months where I couldn't lose any weight at all. I was just at a holding pattern. And I was like, well, yeah, you're like 12. Like your body is, changing and growing and things are happening.
And it's holding on to that fat and that energy for dear life so that it can do the functions that it needs to do, because that's important.
Exactly. They really get you with the meetings and the inspirational, motivational speakers who are there basically. But it doesn't teach you about food. And to me, it just taught me how to be more disordered with my food.
Right. Yeah. Because I'm sure like all the tips and tricks and stuff are things that you wouldn't have necessarily known about unless you had maybe pored over women's magazines or been in sort of forums that were really dedicated to weight loss hardcore. But like,
totally. It allowed me to pretend I wasn't doing disordered eating, because by the time you're a teenager, you like know what anorexia is, what bulimia is. But I was like, well, I'm not doing those things. I'm just like exercising so I can have fewer points for the day, Like it gave me this like false sense of being quote unquote healthy.
Well, yeah, it's interesting like how teenagers are taught about eating disorders. And I don't know if this is still the case. I hope that in some places maybe the, nuances are elaborated a little more, but I doubt it from what I've heard from parents and teenagers themselves and stuff. Like it doesn't really get taught that eating disorders and disordered eating can look a million different ways, and they don't have to look like these stereotypical pictures of anorexia and bulimia, and that also binge eating is a thing, and that also eating disorder not otherwise specified, or whatever they're calling it now, other specified feeding and eating disorder is a thing, and that has elements of all different kinds of eating disorders mixed up in particular ways for particular people. And that it's not just like, well, if you're not purging, then everything's fine, or if you're not eating anything at all, then everything's fine. It's like, no, actually, those are very destructive behaviors, of course. But also there's tons of other destructive behaviors in there that are, just as harmful to people's mental and physical health that we are not talking about.
Totally. Yeah, I didn't know that binge eating was a disordered eating practice until college. And I definitely wouldn't have seen myself as someone with disordered eating because I thought of myself as fat, and fat people can't have eating disorders, because if you really did, you'd be thin, was like my thinking,
I know, because that's the stereotypical picture of it. It's like always, supposed to look emaciated if you have an eating disorder. So you can't have one if you don't, which that's one of the things that I am just always highlighting again and again on this podcast is that eating disorders don't have a certain size. They don't look a particular way. They can affect people of all genders, ethnicities, gender identities, like whatever, sexual orientation, like across the spectrum, and people of all body sizes and shapes. You don't have to look like, and in fact, most people don't look like the stereotypical picture of an eating disorder. Like even I, who was, in a thin body my whole life and have had thin privilege because of that, was not shielded from having an eating disorder, but I also was not diagnosed as having an eating disorder when I did, because even though I was still in a thin body, I never got to that level of emaciation that people were worried. So
totally. When I was in 8th grade and I did grow a little bit, and so my body grew up a little bit and I lost a little weight. And I tried to seize on that as an opportunity to lose more weight to what I thought my goal weight should be, which, by the way, was a goal weight provided to me by my doctor. And there were like 2 weeks where I literally just, and obviously I didn't like lose any weight then, because your body doesn't lose weight when you're starving it. And I got on the scale every day and was so upset that I wasn't going down any, because I knew I was going to the doctor. I went to the doctor. The doctor told me, oh, you're still above what you need to be healthy. And I felt like just giving up, because I was like, I don't know what else I can do to get to what you want me to be healthy. you quote unquote, you know?
Oh my God. So it was like you went to such extremes and it wasn't even enough. It wasn't even good enough, quote unquote.
Exactly. Yeah. And it was so silly, like looking back on it, because like, I don't know why so many doctors are so stuck on BMI or numbers, because like my body looked and was a healthy weight. Like it was fine as to the extent that there is a healthy weight. But like I was not what anyone would consider fat or overweight at that point. And yet my doctor was still telling me that I was overweight by a large amount.
That is ridiculous. How did they, I mean, yeah, nobody deserves to have that told to them. Nobody deserves to be told to lose weight, even if they are in a larger body, even if they are in the quote unquote overweight or obese category. But it boggles my mind when I hear stories like this, because I'm like, how entrenched is fat phobia that doctors are telling people who aren't even anywhere near those categories that they should lose weight too? It's like, again, it's not okay for anyone, but like the fact that people are so scared of fat that weight loss is being prescribed willy-nilly to everyone, I think just demonstrates how terrified people in this culture are of fat.
I totally agree. I mean, it's wild, like thinking about that moment for me, because it was literally the thinnest I've ever been in my entire life. Cause like I had just grown like 3 inches. My body was like stretched out. And I was wearing like a smaller size than I ever have. And like my body felt like it wanted to be about pounds heavier. Do you know what I mean? Like I felt too light and like I was hungry all the time. And yet the doctor was still saying, for your height, you need to be like X pounds smaller. And I felt such despair because it was so clear, like, I can't get there. There's no way I can't get there. I'm barely walking around, you know? So then I just kind of like gave up on that. And that was like kind of the height of restriction for me. And then I started more like yo-yo dieting and more patterns of like binging and then restricting and that kind of thing after that, because I kind of decided that my body was defective because I could tell that it wasn't ever going to get to that weight. And that like is so damaging when in reality, if I'd had a doctor who was like, how does your body feel? Or how are you able to move? Like, how do the foods you eat make you feel? That would have been a mindset that I never thought of or experienced before. And it would have taught me so much more about how to treat and respect my body as a teenage girl.
Amen to that.
And even like now for the podcast we do, we get letters or emails from doctors who literally say things like, I know you're right that what I've read about the science says that diets don't work, but it's like comorbid with a lot of things. So I still tell people to lose weight because I don't know what else to say. And I'll be like, well, that's not my problem, man. You're the doctor. Like you figure it out, like push for change in your own field. But like, I don't have to tell you. I'm not the scientist. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, they're sort of looking to you to be absolved of guilt almost or something.
Exactly. I'm like, no, sorry.
Right. And I mean, I think that is such a good testament also to like how entrenched diet culture is in the medical field, that physicians can be like, we see the science, we get it, diets don't work, but weight is associated with all these health conditions. And so what's the solution? I guess we have to still tell people to lose weight when like Occam's razor, I'm always using that phrase. It's like this idea in medicine that you have to look for like the simplest or most parsimonious solution, not like invent some, fabricated wild goose chase to like explain a phenomenon. And I feel like that is such an example of people inventing these wild things, and saying like, well, it's associated, so we still have to tell people to lose weight, instead of looking at, okay, what's a reason that it could be associated with all these other conditions? And we have science showing that weight stigma is a likely cause or at least major contributor to all of these health conditions that are associated with being in a larger body. And then in fact, the weight stigma could explain all of it, could explain all of the excess risk seen in people in larger bodies for things like heart disease and diabetes and all of that. So why not look at that? Why not start there and say, oh, well, if it's associated and weight stigma could explain things, how do I structure my practice and my work with people so that I'm helping combat weight stigma or at least not perpetuating it?
Yeah, exactly. Or there's like an article I was reading recently where someone was saying that like if you control studies for how people eat instead of their weight. The like weight correlation disappears because it's like it actually does make a difference in quote unquote health if you're like eating to make your body feel and be the best it can be. And that doesn't really correspond all the time with weight at all.
And people in larger bodies who've been told to lose weight are doing pretty disordered things in the name of weight loss. And engaging in disordered eating behaviors is not good for your body, no matter what effect it has on your weight or your size. It's still, it's like eating in a more intuitive way where you can actually take pleasure in food and have a variety of different foods and stuff leads to better health outcomes than that kind of disordered eating.
Yeah, I'm the largest I've ever been now. I mean, actually, I'm not totally sure if that's true because I don't weigh myself, so I may have fluctuated some. But like the last couple of years, I'm like the largest or the fattest I've ever been. And yet in the last year, just accepting myself and actually going after like getting healthcare for the issues with my body, I'm also like the healthiest I've been in several years. When I wasn't able to really advocate for myself or talk about what was going on with my body before because of a lot of issues of like shame and hoping that things would just go away or like feeling like my body was broken, that kind of thing.
That's really good to hear, that you've come to a place of acceptance and that it's helped you feel better in your body too, like feel more, have better well-being and better health.
Totally. I mean, a lot of it was just I had a lot of issues, like I mentioned, like I've always had like immune or inflammatory things pop up. And it wasn't until the last couple years when a lot of them really kind of came to a head where there were things where I was like, I don't feel good, but I'm going to just kind of ignore it. Like 2 years ago, I was like, I feel really bad all the time and I can't ignore it any longer. And I started aggressively going after trying to figure out what these things were because the doctors that I had seen just chalked everything up to me being fat. And especially because so many of my issues are like I have IBS and SIBO and like a lot of gut related things. And the first things doctor would say when I would be like, my stomach hurts all the time, they'd be like, well, you need to have less chocolate. And I'd be like, I'm not really eating a lot of chocolate. Like, I don't think that's it. And so I had to like do research on my own to figure things out and then go in and be like, I think it's this. What would you do for this if it were not me? You know what I mean?
Right. What would you do for a thin person with this condition?
Exactly. So like just doing that and then realizing that like, because I had such a disconnect from years of trying to do disordered eating and then trying to protect myself from it, I had such a disconnect from what I ate and how it made me feel. So last year I started working with a nutritionist and like the process of going through foods and figuring out how I felt after I ate them was so difficult because it involved paying attention so closely to how I felt. And in the years before, I'd been like, okay, I'm going to kind of separate, like pull my brain out a little bit of my body in a way to try to get away from disordered eating. And I had protected myself from going back to any kind of disordered eating by just like not paying attention to the food, mind, body connection at all, because it felt so scary too. Because anytime I did, I felt afraid I was going to fall back into disordered habits. And it was like a super hard, scary process, but I'm like so much healthier and happier now and like still have a lot of stuff to figure out and work on. But just even the first 3 months I worked with my nutritionist, we literally just worked on being like, how did you feel after you ate this? Were you able to pay attention to how you felt in your body? Because that was so hard for me at that time.
It really is. And I think, it's worth saying to anyone who's on this journey listening that like, I think it's protective for a certain period of time when you're recovering from disordered eating to like not think about that stuff. Cause I think you kind of need some time to let the diet culture voices in your head die down and to push back against them and just be like, fuck that. I'm eating this ice cream or whatever, I'm going to eat what I want. And that's huge. And that's so valuable. But then, yeah, at a certain point, I think it's like further along if you can find someone to work with, like a nutritionist who is not steeped in diet culture and who gets it and can help you gently tune inward and figure out what's going on in your body, you might find a lot more kind of nuance to your relationship with food and a lot more connection to how you really feel. And I think that's really tricky for anyone who struggles with any orthorexic thinking, because I know definitely people with orthorexia tend to go down these rabbit holes of like, well, gluten makes me feel this way, and sweet potatoes make me feel this way, and dairy makes me feel this way, and get really like hyper focused on how something makes them feel to the point of kind of creating psychosomatic reactions almost because of so much anxiety about particular foods. And, that's not to say that all reactions to foods are psychosomatic, but I think there's a lot, especially in our diet culture, the way that it's shape-shifted now and turned into this wellness culture in this day and age, that, it's something to be really mindful of and careful of, and not let yourself kind of go down that orthorexic rabbit hole, which is what it sounds like you were you were being very careful about it. And that's probably why it was so hard to then go back into it.
Totally. Exactly. Yeah, I definitely needed like kind of a cooling off period before I could go into it. It's funny. I was like, I'm sure you've read Taffy Brodesser-Akner's really good piece about Weight Watchers and orthorexic culture. And she has that moment in there where she talks about going to like an eating recovery kind of group where the person had them just put a grape in their mouth and like feel it and then be like, what would it feel like to eat this? And I read it, and a thin friend of mine who has never had any kind of disordered eating read it. And she was like, what are they doing there? And I was like, what do you mean? And she was like, how would you not know, like, if you want to eat a grape or not? And I was like, how do you know if you do? Like, it was just so wild to me that she's like, well, you just know what you want to eat and why. And I was like, wow, like, that's crazy to me.
I think that speaks to a certain protection from diet culture, like a way of being just allowed to keep your own intuitive relationship with food for your whole life. And how wonderful is that? But also like not available to everyone because of fat phobia and diet culture.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really interesting. Well, so how did you get from the place of like 16 or so and being really disordered about food and having come out of that really restrictive place to kind of finally deciding to recover and get your disordered eating behind you?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like a mirror of the moment I was describing earlier, where I was just like, I physically can't do anything more, so I should just give up on this for a little while. Where in college, I did a lot of, again, like cycles of binging and restricting. And I've talked about this, like not on my podcast, but like on my Instagram. I did this thing that a couple other people have told me they did too. I think it was called like program. Have you heard of this? Basically, they inject you with like, and then you eat like a very restricted calorie diet and you lose a bunch of weight. And then you gain it all back.
Right. Like every diet.
Yeah. And I did that and had like a lot of shame and secrecy around doing that. And by the way, like my whole family was against me doing it, but I was so determined to be thin by any means possible that I signed up for it and did this like dangerous program that probably like further hurt my health in other ways. And then senior year of college, I like had some outside family stuff happen and got really depressed. And I gained a bunch of weight from going on antidepressants and just being depressed in general and like not and being really lethargic. And I kind of felt very out of control about my body. I mean, I kind of always have felt like that before that. Like I never felt like I could control what my body felt or looked or size it was or whatever. But I felt so disconnected from my body and so out of control of it gaining weight really rapidly in a way that it hadn't before because I'd never been on this medication, et cetera, et cetera. And I was in such like a bad mental health place that I kind of just told myself like, you won't be able to get through the day if you don't put this aside. Like you have to put this aside for now. You need to get better and then you can worry about this later. Like we're going to put this aside, like put it in a box. We're going to put it aside for now. Because I literally just felt like I wasn't going to survive if I was not only depressed and dealing with school and dealing with my family stuff and spending all day like hating myself so viscerally and feeling so uncomfortable and disconnected from my physical form. So I did that. I just told myself like, we'll think about this later and put it aside.
I mean, that's amazing. That is like a strategy that I recommend and a lot of intuitive eating coaches recommend for,
Really?
yeah, for figuring out how to like put aside the weight loss efforts and the body hatred and stuff and just focus on, because when people come to intuitive eating, it's like they really want to heal their relationships with food. They're ready to stop dieting. They're ready to get off that, yo-yo cycle, but oftentimes still have this desire for weight loss in the back of their mind, like, well, hopefully this will also help me lose weight. Hopefully with intuitive eating, the weight will just fall off effortlessly or whatever. And so, really sort of being explicit about it and saying like, that is coming from diet culture. It's totally understandable, but for intuitive eating process to really work, for it to really take and help you make peace with food, we have to put that aside. We have to put that weight loss impulse on the back burner and just focus on your connection with your body and healing that and healing from diet culture. And, it's really hard for people to do, obviously, because it's like compartmentalizing it's not like a physical thing that you're actually putting something in a box and like locking it. It's like those thoughts will bubble up, but making that effort and continuing to be like, okay, no, that goes on the back burner, or that goes on the shelf here. Continuing that practice actually starts to make it easier and easier over time so that those thoughts don't cloud your mind as much,
Yeah, that's so interesting because it definitely wasn't in like an intuitive eating sense. I was doing it because I was like, if I sit here and continue to think about this, I won't get out of bed and then I'm going to fail another class. It was like out of desperation. And my thought definitely was like, I'll put losing weight aside for now. Like it wasn't like I'm done with losing weight. But then what happened was like, I've like had other mental health stuff, but this specifically was a very situation-based, like depressive episode. And so things improved, my mental health improved. And then after college, I was like, oh, I kind of don't really miss that. It's kind of nice not to be thinking about it all the time. And that's when I started being like, oh, I wonder what my other choices are. Like I could choose to open this box again and bring this back. I have the mental space for it now. I could spend all my time thinking about this again. But like, is that my only option? And that's when I started looking into more body positivity. I started following more body positive or fat positive Instagram accounts and Tumblr accounts and filling my feed with more just kind of the revelatory practice of looking at bodies that looked like mine that weren't talking about hating themselves, which was the only other place I'd seen bodies that looked like mine is in like weight loss commercials or spaces that were talking about their bodies, that is. And then when I started doing that, I was like, oh, this is way better. I want to do this. I don't want to go back to that other stuff. That was bad. And then it kind of like developed from there. But it really was like, if I hadn't gotten depressed, I would still probably be, I hope I wouldn't be, but I could very well still be in that whole cycle.
Yeah. So it sounds like the depression was really a jolt. Like it kind of caused you to have to change the way you were doing things. And sometimes those things are such gifts. I definitely don't wish depression on anyone, and I don't wish eating disorders on anyone. And I know that's another way, like, for me, I think having gone through an eating disorder is the only reason that I really was able to pull myself out of, slowly over time with a lot of hard work, recover from diet culture and not be in that sort of middle ground of just disordered eating forever. Because going to such a dark place, like it sort of forces you to reckon with it. It forces you to look at like, what do I really want from my life? How can I proceed from here? It's like, it almost like opens a door.
Yeah. It was really just a moment of being like, I feel so disconnected and dysmorphic from my body right now. And I don't feel like I have any control. And then eventually being able to be like, oh, Sophie, you've never felt like you have control. You've never been able to make your body do the things you want it to do, like said in quotes, all of it. None of the things you've ever done have worked to make you thin. So do we have to go back to that? Or like what? Maybe it's not just that you're bad. Maybe there's other stuff we could think about,
Totally. And that having those alternatives available to you, I think is such a gift also, that like starting to think about what else is out there for me, what are my other options, and then actually being able to see those and engage with those is like kind of, for all the bad things that the internet has brought us, I think it's also brought some amazing things such as that, like that ability to just connect with an alternative way of thinking.
Yes, the internet was very central to that for me. I wasn't seeing it other places. And again, like not because like my family was super bad or disordered about any of it. They just like didn't know and I didn't share a lot of it. So it was like going online and seeing stuff that really like allowed me to be able to bring it more into like the physical realm and talk to people about it.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people's gateway. You know, it's how they get the start to their body acceptance journey. Because I think, like you said, you know, when families are just sort of, they're not particularly disordered, but they're still kind of entrenched in diet culture in some way, and they haven't had to look at it, maybe they're never going to get it right away. You know, maybe they would never say the body positive thing to you that you would have needed to hear at the time. So being able to bring that information in and help them understand it and create a feedback loop where they can then support you is really where it's at.
Totally. I mean, there were a lot of times when I was younger where I would just literally like go to my mom and just cry, like sob about being fat and feeling so unattractive and unappealing. And now it's funny because in retrospect, my mom was like doing kind of a proto body positivity without knowing the words, but she would just tell me like, you have to forgive yourself. Like, it's okay. Like, you're okay. And I just remember so distinctly being like, it's not okay. It's my fault was like my thought, you know? And just like, it took being forced to recognize that aspects of my weight were out of my control, just forced into it for me to finally be like, oh, maybe I can actually forgive myself, meaning like not be mean to myself for being the way that I am.
That's huge.
Yeah.
And what was that journey like for you when you first discovered those body positive people online? Like, how did you sort of move from just being curious about it and sort of seeing what was out there to really embracing it?
It was like a super slow process. There weren't a lot of like big kind of watershed moments because it just happened over such a long period of time where I started like intentionally looking into this thing and like trying to follow more people, and then like over time reading their captions, or you know, not just following activists but also following like fat fashion bloggers and seeing them look happy and doing cool collabs with brands and like participating in the world in a way that I didn't think fat people were allowed to do. And eventually I started, you know, trying more things because of that, being like, oh, well, maybe I can wear this, or like maybe I don't have to say something to undercut myself before I go out with a group of friends, or maybe I am just normal. You know, maybe I don't have to think of myself as abnormal. I can just be me the way that I am, and I don't have to have this self-induced little corral for myself off to the side. What also happened a little bit after I started getting into that is I graduated, and then my best friend and I were both living in my family home in Phoenix, and we were both like doing online dating and trying to like meet people. And like one moment I do remember is deciding to like put what I thought was like very unflattering photo for myself for my profile, and being like, what I really, really don't want, because this was also the time when there were a bunch of videos of, I don't know why this was a thing, but there were a bunch of videos of like guys showing up to dates and then seeing that the girl was like fatter than she was in her pictures, and then leaving and being like mad about it or whatever. And I had watched a video of that, and I was like, oh God, like my nightmare would be showing up to a date and having a man look at you and have the face of like, you look worse than your picture, basically. Do you know what I mean? And so I was like, you know what? I'm just going to be extremely upfront and like see if anybody wants me, because I didn't really date anyone in college. I had like a very nice boyfriend in high school. It was a high school boyfriend. So I made my profile like very recent photos, and this was on OkCupid. There was like a period of time where OkCupid was like the go-to. It was before Tinder and all these. So I wrote all these things like, I'm smart and I like books, and if you're not a feminist, don't talk to me. And like, I just was like, I'm only going to get the good ones, because I'm not going to pretend I'm something I'm not anymore. Like, I'm not doing Spanx on my body or my personality anymore. You know what I mean?
Yes. No Spanx on your personality. I love that too.
Yeah. Like, I'm not doing it. So, and then like what happened was I got a lot of weird messages. I got a lot of like, you know, fat fetishizing messages. And then I also got like Not as many as my best friend, who is like very thin and tall and like kind of traditionally beautiful. She got like a ton of messages, and I got fewer messages, but I also got messages, and that was very surprising to me because I had kind of secretly believed nobody would want me. And I got guys who were just nice guys who like thought I was pretty and wanted to go out with me. And that was so like, it's not that I want to be like, and finding a man made me love myself. But it was like a really cool moment of being like, oh, this thing that I've been telling myself is not true. I'm not unwantable. I'm not unlovable. This is clearly not the case. Like, because I'm not making these people talk to me. They want to talk to me. And I didn't imagine that,
Mm-hmm. It's like counter evidence for that belief about yourself.
Exactly. And I just wanted to like, go on some dates and feel like I was dating and try to approach it in a way that I'd never, like, I'd always approached like romantic encounters before in a way that was like, I'll try to pretend to be as small as possible and like fold in on myself and like, I won't, that kind of thing.
So they won't see me. They won't notice.
Exactly. And I went on a couple dates, and then I started dating the guy who I now live with, who is like my long-term partner, and he's super supportive and very, I wouldn't say he's not body positive. I just mean like, he's not an activist and it doesn't like come up. You know what I mean? He just likes me. He thinks I'm attractive and he likes who I am. And anytime I'm ever like want to talk about stuff, he's like 100% there for it. In a way that like before I had found body positivity, it would have been impossible for me to look at any of our encounters or dates in a way that wasn't forefronted or had a filter over it that was, is he looking at my stomach? Is he thinking about my body in a gross way? Like, is he noticing that I'm fat? And since I didn't have that anymore, I was able to be like, I'm a person and he's a person. And I think that's how he was thinking about it too. It just let me see things in a much more real way.
Yeah, it gave you the brain space, it sounds like, to have a relationship based on lots of other things that wasn't clouded by self-consciousness.
Exactly. There's a moment like after, we'd been dating for a while and our relationship had become more physical, and I had never like talked to him before about weight or disordered eating or my weight or anything. And I was like, oh, I feel a little bit insecure about my body. Like, can you just say that you find me attractive, make me feel better? And he's like, we're in bed. What do you think? Like,
Like, of
like,
course. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, oh yeah, this makes sense. But like, it's so hard to escape from it that it was just so helpful to have a partner there who was like, I think about you. I don't think about, any of the things that you think about you.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, so important and healing. And again, not to be like having a man or a partner is like the be all end all, because I feel like there's a real value also in being single and being comfortable with that. And like, if people don't want to have partners, that's okay too. But I think just sort of, knowing that that's available to you and that's available to all of us, really. Like, there's someone for everyone. I truly believe that there's multiple someones for everyone. Like, you're not like the weird one for whom no one's ever going to find you attractive or whatever. Like, everybody can find someone.
I think about it sometimes now where I'm like, sometimes I'll even say that I'll be like, man, I feel like it would be so much more fun for me to date now. Like, now that I'm so much more positive and comfortable in myself, I'd be like, oh, I would have had such different experiences than when I was in college and just so like fearful about things. And then my boyfriend will be like, are you saying you want to go date? Is this what we're doing now? And I was like, no, I'm just saying, like, I think it'd be so different and like so much more fun than when I was like so scared of everything.
Yeah, it's no fun to be so scared. Like, that's a shitty feeling. I definitely have always been in a thin body, but like have had certainly really bad dating experiences based on other things that I was afraid of people finding out about me, mostly just like how much of a weirdo I am or whatever, like to really letting my true personality come through. And also when I had more body dysmorphia going on, like letting people see the true size and shape of my body also. Like I, would really cover up and use certain angles and photos and stuff like that because I was afraid to show who I really was. And I think about that now and I'm like, God, and I think about the dates that I had too, which for the most part were with pretty nice guys, but then there were definitely those weird ones that I did not see the red flags maybe in their communications or their profiles because I was too wrapped up in like trying to appear a certain way and make them like me and not really worried about did I actually like them. And had some really awful dates because of that and some really awful experiences that were like a little scary. And thinking about that now and thinking like, that was a result of kind of like not valuing myself enough and not having the self-esteem that I have now. I definitely think I would have a better time now if I had to do it all over again. Although thank God I don't. And I don't want to go back to that either. Like happily married, thankfully.
Yeah. April and I, my co-host, we just talked about this on one of our most recent eps, just like she's also fat and she is like so busy with her work and everything right now that she's like, I do not want a boyfriend and I do not need a partner and I don't want anything going on now. And so we have these like totally different experiences. And it's so fun to be able to see her be like, ugh, they're so boring. Men are so boring to me right now. To be like, oh yeah, this is so cool because like, I want to always be mindful and happy about how supportive and kind of a partner I have. But I think like that story is really important too. Just she's like, I don't need anyone to like validate me. I'm fine. And like when the good one shows up, then I'll maybe pay attention to him.
I love that. Yeah, that's so important because I feel like we really, especially women and femmes in our culture, have been told this line from birth that's like, find a man and your life will be complete. Or, even if you're not in that heteronormative kind of thing, it's still out there. There's this pervasive message of like, find a partner and your life will be complete,
It took finding fat positivity and feeling supported in that in my friends and family and partner for me to actually realize that I'm bi. Like I didn't let myself realize that until I felt more embodied and comfortable in myself and my sexuality and my just like having a sexual body. I was like so separate from myself because of how much I was giving hate to myself before that it took me being in like a committed long-term relationship to be like, oh, I think I could date girls actually. And then I was like, well, too late right now.
Right.
Oh, well.
Oh, well.
But like, I never saw, that's one of the reasons that following people like, for example, Nicolette Mason was like really important to me because she's like a plus size lesbian blogger and she does like fashion stuff. And it literally wasn't until I followed her that I was like, oh, you can be fat and like feminine and queer. Like I hadn't seen that representation before and I didn't know it was possible. I thought like, oh, I can't be gay or bi or attracted to women because like all of the representations I see of fat women who are queer are like much more masculine or androgynous or like more butch like in appearance. And so I'm not like that. I'm like a very girly girl. And so I can't be that, It took seeing her and other people like her and then being like in my body and paying attention to my body and my feelings and my thoughts to be like, oh, I didn't know this all. I thought I just, liked following like lesbian couples on YouTube because I thought they were nice. It's like, no, that's not it at all.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love that. I think it really speaks to how much body acceptance goes beyond just like accepting how you look, right? Or accepting your size and shape. It's like it's about all these layers of your experience in your body that we're just cut off from and shut off from because we're taught to focus so much on the external. And like once you stopped being so pressured to focus on the external, you were able to tap into this deeper like internal level where you could actually feel this attraction and sort of like other aspect of your sexuality. Or it sounds like probably just a flourishing of your sexuality in general too, because you were sort of tamping it down before.
Yeah, totally. It was just like also, again, scary to realize, but not in the same way as it was scary to try to be body positive. It was just like, trying to figure out like is this true? What does this mean? How do I have to reevaluate anything? When I had thought through it all and talked through it with everyone, like that was important to me, it kind of just was like, oh, no, it's just nice that I am like more cognizant of this aspect of myself now. Like now I know more about myself. And I wouldn't have known that if I had continued to be so focused on blocking out my knowledge of myself in so many ways.
Totally. Yeah. So it's like your knowledge of yourself is deepening and growing with this new acceptance.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm excited to find out like what else I'll find out about myself. I just feel like so much more open to whatever pops up, you know?
Yeah. Oh, I totally feel you on that. I feel like it's so liberating just to be like, I don't care. I don't care about your beauty standards. I don't care about, doing this thing that diet culture has forced on all of us for so long.
Totally. I'm also like, I'm 27 and I'm very excited. I feel like this feeling will only continue as I get older. Just like, even though it does track with my like body acceptance journey, I also think a lot of it tracks with just like being like a girl and being a teenager and then being in your early 20s. I just feel so much more comfortable and confident in my late 20s. And I've like had women in their 30s be like, oh, just wait. And I'm like, oh my God, I cannot wait. I'm so excited.
Totally. No, I'm 36 and I feel like my 30s have just been nothing but upward trends and good stuff and like all the stuff that I wanted in my 20s that, felt so out of reach. And I was just like trying to twist myself into a pretzel to get, when I finally released that pretzel and released that effort. And it was just like, I'm me. That's when the stuff that I wanted started to come.
I'm so pumped for all that, especially just because it so clearly disproves all the like dumb stuff about women being valued for being, young and quote unquote thin and quote unquote pretty. It's like, oh, that's such a like outside lens looking in, because like all the women I know, it's just like you get more and more powerful the older you get. I'm so excited.
I feel like it's also no coincidence that our society puts that on people, because it's like, if it's true really that women and people in general kind of start to come into our own in our 30s and really like know who we are and have this power and have this awareness. And I would argue like this sort of journey out of diet culture is becoming like the modern day coming of age story. I feel like that's like something that's really happening for people in their 20s a lot, is like coming to a point and being like, I can't do this anymore, and sort of like hero's journey into fat acceptance, body acceptance, whatever. But like, if it's really true that, because I think it is, that we really come into our own in our 30s, it's probably no coincidence that society's like, women in their 30s are terrible. Anyone after 35, like Trump said that thing, something like, kick them out of bed after 35 or something like that, like some horrible misogynist thing. But it's like, that's probably no coincidence, because denigrating people and making them feel bad about themselves at a time when they're coming into their full power is a really convenient way to take away some of that power.
It's totally true. I think it's also connected to me also just with like movements against ableism and just kind of connecting the like idea of like a thin, white, cis, like young woman being the most appealing or desirable or whatever. That is so connected to like friends who are in wheelchairs or whatever. A friend in a wheelchair was with me one time when I was having an argument about whether or not it's okay to be fat. And the person I was arguing with said something to me about like, well, it's just not healthy. And like, don't you want to be able to run around with your kids? And I like looked at my friend and she like looked at me and I was like, you're terrible. Like, you're being so insulting, because like, number one, like, yeah, I'm fine. Personally, I will be able to do that. But like, if you are not quote unquote healthy or like young and, an Olympian, like that doesn't mean anything other than the reality of what your body is. That's like all that it means.
Yeah. And like being able to run around with your kids is not the sort of be all end all of life. If you can't run, if you can't move, like for whatever reason, there's lots of other ways of connecting that are available to you. There's lots of other like ways of being joyful and feeling good in your body and like all of that stuff that are available to you. It's not the sort of one size fits all thing.
Yeah, I mean, somehow it feels very connected to me that like now that I figured out, for example, that like stuff bothers my stomach, I like want to try to figure out more specifically what foods bother my stomach. But as I'm sure you've heard from a lot of people, it's like it can be triggering to pay super close attention to what triggers are. So I just know in general, I cut out like a lot of, and nobody ever tells me like, I don't get a lot of pity about it. And I don't get a lot of like, oh my God, don't you wish your body were fixed? Like, don't you wish you were healthy or whatever about it? Especially in LA, people are just like, oh, okay, whatever. And I'm like, why are you not like that about, it's just like, just the way my body works is my stomach hurts if I eat these specific foods. Like, why does that make sense to you? And other things don't make sense to you. Like, oh, the way that my insulin works is like different from yours, And so it like that feels very connected to me, accepting that about myself as I get older too. It turns into things like even simple things like I no longer feel the need to like push to stay out when I'm tired. I go like, I'm going to bed now. Bye. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense kind of as a connection?
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating too to think about how people are sort of willing to accept, like, oh, yeah, your body reacts badly to those foods, of course, like, because that is so okay in terms of per diet culture. That's like what everybody's being pushed to do, kind of. So it's like that's in line with the status quo, whereas like other ways of taking care of your body might not be, seen in the same way as like in line with the status quo or, whatever. And it's so arbitrary. It's like, why is one thing and not another supposedly okay? It's just culture, really.
Or just like, whatever people decide to put on you, which is like tying back into like as I get older and excited to be older, the more that I'm like, you know what, this is just the way my body is and I am. And people can't see all the things about it and they don't know my story and they don't know anything. And just the more comfortable I get with everything, like I obviously want to like continue, part of my work is like fighting for acceptance and respect and stuff, but also like the less important it gets to me to like change people's minds who are determined to be ignorant. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
The more I'm just like, it's the most important to me that I love myself and that the people who are closest to me like support me. That's really all that like truly matters.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a waste of time, I think, to argue with people who are set in their ways and determined to be ignorant. And, there's some people who are on the ignorant side of the spectrum who are like willing to be in conversation or open to change or whatever. But like, I forget who it was that gave me this metaphor, but I think it's really helpful. Like if you're on a train and you're in the front of the train and you're trying to get people to come from the back up to the front, you're not going to go all the way to the caboose and like start there because that's a really long distance to get people to go. But you might start with like the second car or something, people who are a little bit closer to where you are and like talk with them and, try to connect with them about this stuff. But like the people who are all the way over on the side of, fat shame and, hatred of everybody who's different than them and racism and xenophobia and all that stuff, like probably aren't the people who are going to be receptive to it anyway or are ever going to be like your friend. So why bother?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Like it's also about like protection for your own mental health and dealing with this stuff. Like I was part of this photo shoot for this piece about the podcast and the person doing like hair and makeup was like, can I ask you a question? Like, why do you call yourself fat? And I was like, oh, I don't think that fat is a bad word. And she had this like, like she really like took it in and was like thinking about it. And we like chatted a little bit longer. And that was like cool and felt good because I was like, okay, I don't think she like had been exposed to that before. And like maybe she will think more about it and like talk more about it, because she asked and she was interested in it, especially because it's such a personal journey. Like I'm sure people told me before I found body positivity about it, like I was saying about how my mom tried to my whole childhood, she tried, even though she was like not sure what to do, she tried to be like, I think you're okay. Like you need to be okay with like how your body works. I just didn't hear it. I didn't want to. I wasn't ready to.
Well, and you got so many messages to the contrary from everywhere else, I'm sure. You said you like got teased at school and doctors were saying things to you. And it's like, that's all got a lot of weight when you're a kid or anytime, getting those kinds of messages. So like one person being like, no, it's okay, might not really hold as much for you.
Which is why it's like, yeah, I am going to stay where I'm safe and where I feel comfortable and like make resources available to whoever wants to come and learn them. But you can't force people, you can't make people buy into something, even if they would be like freer and so much happier with it.
Yeah. And I get that question a lot. I feel like a lot of the questions people ask are like, how do I talk to X person in my life who is still really stuck in diet culture? Or how do I argue for this in a space that's really diet focused and weight centric? And it's like, I think there are certainly like little inroads you can make and seeds you can plant in any conversation, but also sometimes it's not safe to do that. And sometimes you have to put your mental health first and you have to say like, that's them, that's their shit. I don't want to get in there and stir it around. I'm going to just let them be over there with their shit and like stay here in a place where I feel safe,
Yeah, we get those a lot too. My answer is always just like, if people are open to talking, then talk with them about it. And like, if they're not, then I honestly think that setting firm boundaries can start a lot of conversations. If you have someone in your life who is not open to all of this, and then you say like, hey, I'm no longer going to tolerate you talking about diets or telling me to diet. So I will leave the room when you start talking to me about that. If they are in a place where they like won't understand that, I do think it like makes an impact on people if you set that kind of firm boundary, if you're able to, like I've definitely done that and then had people eventually kind of come around more and be more open to talking about things because they go like, oh, whoa, this really is a big deal,
Yeah. And I think sometimes people aren't even aware of their behavior or how much they talk about that subject. And I think if you're committed to like leaving the room every time or changing the subject or, whatever your solution is every time that someone brings that stuff up, it kind of highlights to them too, like, oh, wow, I talk about this a lot, I guess. And it's weird that that person's having this reaction, but maybe there's a reason for it, and at least they can kind of like open their minds slightly to why you might feel so strongly about it that you have to set that boundary.
Totally. If you're able to, I definitely think setting a boundary is like a more effective strategy than just like ignoring it or like biting your tongue. Because if you do that, then the other person doesn't know or doesn't get the reinforcement that it's not okay.
Totally. Yeah. And setting a boundary is hard, of course. And it's like for those of us who want to please other people, it's really challenging because we want to be nice and go along with stuff. And setting boundaries can be like a real art and practice in and of itself. But I think it's so important for everything in life. I think, setting boundaries, it's a skill that goes beyond just not having diet culture in your face all the time. It's a skill that extends to getting what you want and need in so many aspects of your life.
Totally. I mean, I set boundaries with myself all the time. Like it's a really helpful process to be like able to have the words and tools, meaning like boundaries and and mental health and body positivity, to be like, I am not going to let myself talk to myself about this like this. I wouldn't let anyone else say this to me. I'm not allowing myself to say it to me. And like being able to navigate the difference between that and just not listening to myself, if that makes sense. Like finding the navigation between like, this is not truly what I need to hear telling myself. Like this is disordered eating trying to creep back in. This is like insecurity creeping in versus like, this is me talking to myself about my truth. And like setting those boundaries within yourself is so important because like, otherwise, you'd just be like a huge roiling, mess of id, basically. You gotta be like, this is helpful, this is not helpful. And like, that's okay to do, I think, with yourself as well.
Absolutely. I think that's such a strategy and key to being able to recover from disordered eating or really any behavior that's causing you pain, is like to really take a look at that and say, I'm slipping back into this thing that I know isn't serving me. And so what am I going to do about it? Let me set a boundary here rather than just like you said, sort of thinking that it's just the way things are and letting your mind, letting your thoughts sort of rule you instead of recognizing like, I am not my thoughts. I have the ability to determine which thoughts I entertain and which thoughts I shut down, and shutting them down doesn't have to be sort of like a suppression technique. It can be a dialogue where you're like, listen, I know part of myself that's telling me I need to cut out X, Y, and Z food right now, that you're coming from a good place. and you want the best for me, but I know that that is really disordered and would not serve me and would not be helpful. So I'm actually not going to listen to you in this case, but thank you for your input and good day.
Totally.
You know?
Yeah. And that's like all that stuff it happens so much just in these like private, secret corners of our head. Like that's one of the main reasons we wanted to start our podcast, is to be like, a lot of these conversations we have or talk about these things that come up for us, we would think about them or talk about them with one person, and it felt so alone, or like I felt so like, is this happening to anyone else? Or like, does anyone else go through this? Or like, I want to know what other people's perspectives on this are, you know? And we were like, oh man, I wonder if it would be cool to like have other people hear these conversations. And turns out it is. Like, I'm sure you get a lot of messages about this too, where people are just like, wow, I feel so like less alone just hearing other people say these things that I think about too.
Totally. Yeah. I feel like that's such a gift of podcasts in general. Like also when I started mine, I was listening to a lot of like Mark Maron and Pete Holmes and like people who were doing these podcasts that got really deep with, you know, usually like an actor or comedian or something on just life, like life issues. But people would be talking about like their alcoholism or their drug addiction or their, you know, some people would talk about eating disorders or eating issues. And just hearing that was so freeing to me, because at the time I was, you know, this was like, I don't know, 5.5 years ago, I was still in the later stages of my recovery from all this stuff, where I was like, okay, I went through this and I'm really ashamed of having gone through this. And it's kind of like this shameful secret that I'm harboring. And so just to like hear all these people talk about their secret shame, quote unquote, too, was like, oh, wait, I'm not broken. I'm not the weird one. I'm not alone in having had mental health issues and all this stuff. So, you know, when I started the podcast, I was like, I wanted to be the Mark Maron of food and have it be like centered all around, you know, people's weirdness with food, just to sort of show like, hey, we all have some weird stuff with food. And then it kind of morphed into more, you know, specific like disordered eating recovery, health at every size, as I got more and more information about all that stuff. But like sort of at the outset, it was just like, let me just help people feel less alone, because this medium helped me feel so much less alone.
Totally. I mean, that's like April, my co-host, and I we're both writers. April's a TV writer and I'm a freelance writer. And like, I'm currently working on like a YA novel that's like a fantasy novel with like a fat protagonist who's a girl. Because like that is the genre I read so much of. I was such like a book escapist when I was a kid. And there were like there's like a couple books that have chubby girl protagonists. But if I had read about a girl who was like had a romantic relationship or didn't want to, was just like pining, you know, and was fat and was like powerful or central to a story, like the main character, I just wonder how that would have changed things for me, you know, to be able to see myself represented in that way. And April is working on that as well, like in TV land, just like this, the same way that, you know, like some of the books that have been coming out recently, like Dietland or Dumplin', are like so important for that. Just like the main thing I think I can do is just be like, here's me and here's what I think and here's what I would have wanted to read, because I can only guess that like there's other people like me who would have wanted the same thing as well and felt less alone with it.
Absolutely. I love that so much. Tell us where people can find your podcast and learn more about your work, because we're almost out of time.
Oh, for sure. So you can find us on any social media at She's All Fat Pod. You can download us on the iTunes or the Apple Podcast Store or on a bunch of Android apps. If you want to get specific links for them, you can just go to www.shesallfatpod.com. We're in our second season right now, and we have a lot of apps about various things, everything from, we do like a fatty film school series where we talk about various pieces of media, and we have listener mailbags where we answer specific questions. We just talked about being fat and dating. And yeah, we're a weekly show. We talk about these things together. We talk about the intersections of our identities. We're both cis women, but April is Black and straight and fat, and I'm white and queer and fat. And so we have a lot of different things to talk about, and we have a lot of fun.
It's so great. I love the show and I love your rapport with each other. And just like, I feel like I always learn something new or just get a good laugh and perspective on things that I'm really grateful for. So
Thank you. We have fun too. Part of our motto is like chill vibes only. And we try to just create that space for ourselves in addition to for our listeners, just to be like, man, a lot of things are crazy and weird and bad, but like this is going to be our space where we like get to be us and talk about things and do whatever we want.
I love it. Yeah. And talking about pop culture too, I feel like it's so great because it's like there's so much stuff out in the world that comes out that has like a bearing on body acceptance and positivity that, you know, it's really great that you sort of dissect that in your podcast as well.
Totally. It's so fun. I mean, that's April and I are both big. We're just like pop culture nerds. So we talk about all of it. And like some of it you have to just kind of laugh at and be like, whatever. Because so much pop culture is just like very anti-fat. But like some of it too is just very fun and uplifting and you can participate in it, you know, kind of no matter what size you are, what you look like or whatever. And some of it directly does celebrate us. So we try to talk about all those things and how to navigate all those things. And really just like, and we also on our website, we have links to like some other podcasts or resources by other fat creators as well. If you're just looking to like fill up your feed with more like fat specific podcasts, but we like kind of feel like there's so much, especially living in LA, every single white guy has a podcast and they talk about like nothing. And they're just like one time we were working on the pod, like at a coffee shop and our waiter came over and he was like, what are you girls up to? And we were like working on our podcast. And he was like, oh, cool. I have a podcast too. My friends and I, yeah, we were like, oh, cool. He's like, my friends and I get drunk and we tell stories about our lives. It's called The Boy and the Beard. And I was like, of course it is. Like, of course it fucking is.
Oh.
Like every guy in LA has like, oh, the basketball dudes podcast. Like, oh, the woodworking male
Dudes.
podcast.
Yeah.
Like, you know? So I'm just like, oh man, I think what we're doing is cool. And I hope that one day we're like, there's 1,000 more podcasts like yours and ours that just like talk about things that are so important to us and focus on figuring out how to move through life together.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a delight talking with you. And yeah, I appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I love your podcast and I love hearing all the interesting people you have on. And yeah, your podcast is one of the ones that makes me feel less alone and more like, oh, we're all figuring this out. We're like all really working towards this thing together. And I think that's so cool.
Thank you. I love that. That's great to hear. So that is our show. Thanks again so much to Sophia Carter-Kahn for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some practical tips to get you started on your anti-diet journey, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. You can find all the platforms and subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. And subscribing and sharing on one of the Apple platforms helps bring us up higher in the podcast rankings so that more people discover us and so that we can continue to drown out the pro-diet messages and keep rising up in that health category. And of course, nice ratings and reviews are always appreciated, so you can leave those in your podcast provider of choice. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we mentioned, plus a full transcript, head over to christyharrison.com/153. That's christyharrison.com/153. And to get the transcript, just go to the bottom of the page and enter your email address where it says, get the transcript. Thanks so much to our editors and engineers at Podcast Fast Track, and to my Food Psych Programs team, our community manager and content development associate, Ashley Saruya, our administrative assistant, Sarah Thompson, and our transcript assistant, Megan Saichi, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into creating this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble, and the music you're hearing behind me now is by a band called AWOL, and the track is called Food, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.
Stupid or scared, no work in the kitchen now. Who put you there in that perfect position now? Bullies want your food, and you ain't really beat. Have you ever went over your friend's house?